The blazing sunset burned like a giant flame, dyeing the entire western sky red as it poured down on a magnificent mansion palatial in grandeur, nestled in the heart of a lush green valley. Pristine white rose petals, pure as the first snow of winter, were strewn along a sparkling cobblestone path that led to the heart of the wedding of the century, an event the elite had been buzzing about for months. From towering ancient oak branches, dozens of crystal chandeliers suspended in the air, each crystal shimmering like a stolen star from the night sky, casting opulent reflections onto the meticulously manicured garden below. The stirring sound of violins blended with joyous laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses composing a symphony of power, wealth, and prestige. The guests, members of America's most elite social class, glided past one another in dazzling haute couture gowns and sharply tailored suits. They sipped champagne from delicate flutes and exchanged stories about Mediterranean yacht vacations, multi-million-dollar deals on Wall Street, and dinner parties with influential politicians. This was more than just a wedding. It was a stage where the upper class showcased their wealth and influence. At the center of that stage stood the Bennett family, white Americans of noble lineage, with a business empire stretching from New York to Los Angeles, looming like royalty, their proud gazes sweeping across the crowd as if they owned the entire world. But then, amidst that resplendent scene, came a moment that made time itself seem to stand still. The intricately carved wooden gates slowly opened, and Mrs. Rosa Washington, an elderly black American woman with shimmering silver hair, stepped inside. She moved slowly, not because of age, but with a calm dignity, as if she carried a century of history on her small yet resilient shoulders. Though elegant and exquisitely tailored, her deep indigo dress was so simple, it seemed almost out of place amid the sea of glittering diamonds and luxurious silk. Her warm brown eyes swept over the crowd, lit with quiet joy at the thought of her grandson James, who was about to marry the woman he loved. There she stood, Rosa, a small yet commanding figure, like a mountain standing firm in a storm. But the Bennett family, who saw themselves as the center of this universe, spared her only a cold glance. Margaret Bennett, the bride's mother, stood near the main entrance, holding a glass of red wine, her lips pressed into a tight, contemptuous smile. Her gaze swept from Rosa's head to toe, as though assessing an object unworthy of appearing in her flawless collection. Charles Bennett, the bride's father, a man with salt and pepper hair and the demeanor of someone used to wielding power, didn't even bother to turn his head. He tilted it slightly, as if Rosa were nothing more than a nameless silhouette, a stray ink mark on the masterpiece of high society they had so carefully painted. The guests nearby, though silent, were complicit. They averted their eyes from Rosa and continued their conversations about stocks and real estate, as though her presence was an inconvenience not worth acknowledging. Chuckles, furtive glances, and discreet shrugs floated through the air like a bitter soundtrack. But Rosa remained undaunted. She stood there with her hands gently clasped, a kind smile still resting on her lips, as if she had long grown accustomed to such stares, to such whispers. There was only one thing the Bennett family didn't know, a secret quietly waiting to erupt like a storm. They thought Rosa was just an ordinary older woman who didn't belong in their glittering world. They believed their arrogance, built on wealth and status, would forever shield them from any reckoning. But they were wrong. Wrong. When night falls, when the chandeliers dim into shadows, they, the noble Bennett family, will kneel before Rosa, begging for forgiveness, drowned in utter shame under the gaze of the entire world. As the sunset slowly faded, the last rays of daylight gave way to the dazzling glow of crystal chandeliers, transforming the mansion's garden into a resplendent stage where every eye turned toward the couple. Sophia Bennett, the bride, as beautiful as a muse, walked in her white silk wedding gown, each fold shimmering like a silver river under the lights. Her golden hair was styled in an elegant bun, revealing a slender neck, and sapphire blue eyes sparkling like a summer lake. Beside her stood James Washington, the Black American groom, tall and captivating in a tailored black suit. His radiant smile seemed to warm the entire space, but his deep brown eyes revealed a longer story of a man who had fought against prejudice to reach the summit. Their love story was a breeze that swept through the upper class, stirring grand ballrooms and elegant tea salons in Manhattan. Sophia, the eldest daughter of the Bennett family, was the crown jewel of a white American business empire, with skyscrapers bearing their name stretching from New York to Los Angeles. Born into luxury, she was raised amid lavish galas, where every door opened with the snap of a finger. Her father, Charles Bennett, was a real estate mogul who could shake the market with a single decision. Her mother, Margaret, embodied elegance, always smiling perfectly. Yet that smile was as cold as a blade. With her beauty and pedigree, Sophia was the dream of every elite bachelor. Yet her heart belonged to someone entirely different. In stark contrast to Sophia's world, James Washington grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, where pothole-ridden streets and crumbling buildings told stories of struggle. The son of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to support the family, James learned early how to turn dreams into reality. With a sharp mind and unbreakable will, he earned a scholarship to a prestigious university where he overcame suspicious stares and graduated at the top of his class. From there, he built a multi-million-dollar tech company, symbolizing resilience in a society still laced with barriers for Black men. He was not just a businessman, but an inspiration proof that talent and effort could shatter any limit. They met at a business conference in New York, where James's eyes, deep and determined, locked with Sophia's blue gaze across the crowd. A fleeting moment that changed them both forever. From conversations over coffee to long nights sharing dreams, they built a passionate love that defied all barriers of race and background. When James knelt beneath the twinkling lights of Central Park to propose, Sophia cried not because of the diamond ring, but because she knew she had found a man willing to face the entire world with her. But tonight, amid the stirring violins and sweet toasts, a cold wind quietly crept through the rose garden. Though guests raised their glasses in celebration, polite smiles concealed whispered curiosities about this unexpected union. A girl like Sophia choosing someone like that, murmured one guest, half in admiration, half in doubt. Though publicly supportive of the marriage, the Bennett family betrayed subtle signs of discontent. Holding a glass of red wine, Margaret smiled as James and Sophia walked through the floral aisle, but her smile was stiff, as if carved from stone. Standing beside her, Charles subtly furrowed his brow when James took Sophia's hand, as though that simple act was an invisible provocation. They played the role of open-minded parents, but their eyes told another story of arrogance and prejudice, hidden beneath the veneer of civility. And somewhere amid the shimmering lights of the celebration, a bitter drama was quietly taking shape. The clink of champagne glasses, the echoing laughter, and the soft classical music could not mask the truth that the Bennett family, standing atop their pedestal of power, was about to face a storm they never saw coming. A storm named Rosa Washington, the woman they had scorned from the moment she stepped through the gate. As the sun entirely vanished, the light from the crystal chandeliers burst forth like thousands of stars, illuminating the mansion's garden into a sea of lavish brilliance. The stirring violins blended with the ringing laughter of guests, as if the entire world was lost in a golden dream. Pristine white roses, pure as winter snow, blanketed the cobblestone path, leading past tables draped in white silk and fragile champagne flutes. The guests, clad in haute couture gowns and tailored suits, glided past each other with polite smiles, though their eyes were sharp, always looking for ways to cement their status in high society. This was a stage of power and prestige, where every gesture was calculated, and the Bennett family, white Americans of aristocratic lineage, stood at the center like monarchs on invisible thrones. But then, in the middle of this symphony of arrogance, a quiet yet powerful moment made time seem to stop. A sleek black car with curves smooth like a hunting panther slipped through the intricately carved wooden gates and stopped beneath the shade of an ancient oak. The door opened, and Mrs. Rosa Washington, Groom James's grandmother, stepped out with the gentle support of her grandson. Her silver hair shimmered like moonlight, neatly tied back, framing a face that retained regal poise despite the deep lines etched by time. Her warm brown eyes, deep like a river, carrying untold stories, swept over the crowd with a kind smile, as though she could see through all the glitz to the true nature of people. Mrs. Rosa wore a deep indigo dress, elegant yet modest, with exquisite tailoring that never sought attention. Amid the sea of sparkling diamonds and expensive silk, her dress stood as a silent declaration. Dignity requires no display. She moved slowly, not because of age, but with a natural calm, as if she bore a century of history on her small but resolute shoulders. Each step she took was a rhythm light yet firm, like the beat of a drum signaling change. There she stood, a small figure full of presence like a tall mountain, amid a storm, unshaken by stares or whispers. James, his smile bright as sunlight, held her hand, guiding her through the path of white roses. He leaned down and whispered something that made her chuckle, a warm, tinkling laugh, like wind chimes in summer, easing the suffocating air of the gathering. "You look handsome, James," she said in a low, rich voice, her eyes glowing with pride. James laughed heartily and gripped her hand tighter to shield her from the world around them. To him, Mrs. Rosa was not just his grandmother. She was the flame that had guided him through hard times, from the cold, windswept streets of Chicago to the summit of the business world. She was the one who had taught him that a person's worth wasn't in what they owned, but in what they were willing to stand up for. But as they entered the heart of the celebration, the atmosphere grew colder. Curious stares and stiff smiles began to surface. Some guests subtly turned away, resuming their conversations about stocks, real estate, or Maldives vacations, as if Mrs. Rosa's presence were a minor interruption not worth noting. A woman in a glittering sequin gown whispered to her friend just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Who is she? Doesn't look like a key guest." Her friend shrugged her gaze, brushing past Rosa as if she were a nameless figure. Standing near the main stage, the Bennett family maintained their flawless appearance, but their eyes were cold, as if Rosa were a stranger who had wandered into their world. Holding a glass of red wine, Margaret Bennett tilted her head slightly, but her smile was stiff, carved from stone. With his salt and pepper hair and the demeanor of a man always in control, Charles Bennett didn't even glance toward Rosa. He conversed with an important guest, his deep, authoritative voice projecting as though the entire world revolved around him. To them, Rosa was just an unnamed guest, a faded silhouette, unworthy of the attention of the elite. Mrs. Rosa sensed the distance, but her smile did not waver. She had lived too long, faced too many contemptuous stares to be shaken by indifference. In her heart, the joy of today didn't lie in champagne or hollow toasts, but in the moment of witnessing James, the little boy, who once held her hand through cold Chicago streets, now standing tall beside the woman he loved. But deep in her eyes, a spark flickered, not of anger, but of confidence, the kind of confidence held by someone who knows their true worth. Rosa Washington hadn't come just to attend a wedding. She had come to prove something, a truth that the Bennett family, cloaked in arrogance, built on money and status, would soon be forced to confront. And no matter how extravagant the celebration, it could not conceal the rising undercurrent, the quiet wave ready to wash everything away. The crystal chandeliers still glittered above, like stars trapped in an artificial sky, casting light over the mansion's garden, overflowing with laughter and soft classical music. Tables draped in white silk shimmered under the lights, adorned with delicate champagne flutes and plates of finely arranged dishes resembling art. The guests, dressed in glamorous gowns and sharp suits, glided past each other with polite smiles. But beneath the upper-class elegance lingered a chill sharp as a blade when Mrs. Rosa Washington stepped into the center of the celebration. Rosa, with her shimmering silver hair and simple indigo dress, stood beside James, her warm brown eyes glowing with joy at the sight of her grandson. But that joy was soon tested by the crowd's cold glances and dismissive gestures. The Bennett family, those who considered themselves the actual hosts of the evening, stood near the main stage, exuding an undeniable aura of power. In a dazzling pearl green silk gown, Margaret Bennett, Sophia's mother, raised her glass of red wine, her lips pressed into a contemptuous smile as her gaze swept over Rosa. She leaned slightly toward a relative beside her, a middle-aged woman wearing a diamond-studded necklace, and whispered just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Some people don't know the difference between evening attire and everyday clothes." Sharp as an arrow, that remark cut through the air, accompanied by a few hushed chuckles from surrounding guests. A man wearing a gleaming gold watch in a gray suit covered his mouth to laugh, his eyes flicking toward Rosa, as if she were some curious oddity. Another woman dressed in a vivid red gown shrugged and whispered to her companion, probably some distant relative of the groom. Though masked in civility, these words dripped with condescension, as if Rosa, a black older woman in a modest dress, was a blemish on the perfect image of the evening. Rosa heard everything. Though nearing 80 years old, her ears were still as sharp as ever. Yet she remained unshaken. Her gentle smile stayed in place, and her eyes swept over the crowd with the calm of someone who had faced far crueler insults. She had lived through days when racism wasn't whispered. It was slammed doors, stolen opportunities, and eyes that treated her like she didn't exist. Margaret's biting words were nothing more than a breeze compared to what she had already endured. James, standing beside her, felt the injustice like a blow. His radiant smile vanished, jaw-clenched fists tightening. He turned to Rosa, his eyes burning with anger and pain. "Grandma, I'm going to say something," he whispered, voice trembling with restrained fury. He couldn't bear the thought of the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him being treated like an outsider. But Rosa, calm as a mountain, before the storm, placed her frail hand on his arm. "No need, James," she said, her voice warm but resolute. "They're not ready to understand, but they will be." Her words, though soft, carried the weight of prophecy. Her eyes flickered with light, not of rage, but of deep confidence, as though she had already seen how this evening would end. James looked at her, his heart torn between sorrow and overwhelming pride. He knew Rosa was not someone who bowed easily. She was the flame that had guided him through hardship, and now she stood there unfazed by contemptuous stares, a living symbol of resilience. But this act of discrimination was only the beginning. Margaret's whispers and the guests' subtle snickers were mere ripples on the surface. A far greater storm was forming beneath, and the Bennett family, wrapped in their arrogance built on wealth and social status, had no idea they had just ignited a confrontation they could never win. Rosa, with her unshaken smile and piercing gaze, was ready, and as the crystal lights glistened above her petite figure, seemed to grow in stature, a silent warning that truth, no matter how buried, will always find a way to erupt. Beneath the sparkling light of the crystal chandeliers, the mansion garden still glowed like a perfect painting, white silk-covered tables, and delicate violin melodies floating in the air. Yet beneath the lavish surface, a cold wind began to spread, laced with pride and prejudice. Mrs. Rosa Washington, dressed in a modest deep indigo gown, her silver hair shimmering under the lights, stood amidst the crowd, her gentle smile unwavering, even as Margaret Bennett's mocking words still lingered. But if Rosa thought the discrimination would stop at whispered insults, she was mistaken. The Bennett family's arrogance, forged through decades of power, was preparing to escalate their contempt to a new level. Charles Bennett, father of the bride. Sophia stood near the main stage, radiating the authority of a man accustomed to commanding the world. With salt and pepper hair and a perfectly tailored gray suit, he embodied success in America's white elite. His cold eyes scanned the crowd, but when they landed on Rosa, he merely gave a curt nod, a perfunctory gesture, as if she were a faint silhouette unworthy of his concern. No handshake, no greeting, just a chilly nod, as though Rosa's presence were a nuisance in the power tableau he had so carefully curated. To Charles, she was just another nameless guest, the groom's grandmother, whom he had reluctantly tolerated for the sake of the wedding. But Charles's indifference didn't stop there. As James led Rosa toward the dining area, Charles turned to a close friend, a fellow real estate magnate with a flashy smile, and remarked in a voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, "You see, sometimes we have to invite less fitting people for the sake of our children." The words, wrapped in a polite tone, cut like a knife, implying that Rosa, perhaps even James, were outsiders in his refined world. A few nearby guests chuckled softly, their eyes drifting toward Rosa with curiosity and condescension, as if she were an oddity to be observed from a distance. The entire Bennett family seemed silently complicit in this attitude. One of Sophia's aunts, dressed in a golden silk gown, furrowed her brow as Rosa passed by, then leaned over to whisper to a relative, "She looks like she wandered in from somewhere else." Though quietly spoken, these words rippled outward like a wave, followed by assessing glances and strained smiles from other Bennett family members. They exchanged discreet looks and subtle shrugs, as if Rosa's presence was an inconvenience they had to endure. Not one of them stopped to speak with her. No one offered a toast or asked her about James. Rosa didn't exist to them, except as a stark reminder of the difference between their world and his. Standing by her side, James felt every glance, every whisper like a dagger into his pride. His smile had long vanished, replaced by a hardened expression. His hands clenched tight, holding back the storm rising within. He looked at Rosa, his eyes filled with pain and helplessness. "How dare they?" he whispered, his voice trembling with rage. He wanted to step forward to confront Charles, Margaret, and the entire Bennett clan for the way they treated the woman who had given her life to raise him. But Rosa, calm as a still lake before a storm, placed her thin hand on his arm, her gaze flashing with quiet fire. "Stay calm, James," she said, her voice low but commanding. "Some lessons take time to sink in, and their time is coming." Her words gentle as they were carried the weight of a warning. They were more than just comfort for James. They were a silent promise that the Bennett family's arrogance would soon be exposed. Rosa stood there, small yet unyielding, like a glowing ember, waiting for the right moment to ignite. Her smile remained steady, but her eyes had sharpened, as if she had already seen how the night would end. Meanwhile, the Bennett family, cloaked in self-importance and polite facades, continued mingling through the crowd, unaware that they had just sown the seeds of a storm they would never withstand. And though the violins still played, the wedding air had grown heavier, like the entire garden was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to erupt. Light from the crystal chandeliers continued to pour down on the mansion garden, casting shimmering streaks across the white silk-covered tables where champagne flutes and artfully plated dishes told a tale of luxury. The soft strains of violins mingled with guests' laughter, but the elegant air now carried a different flavor, one of pride and prejudice, sharp as shattered glass beneath fine silk. Mrs. Rosa Washington, in her modest, deep indigo dress and shimmering silver hair, stood among the crowd, her gentle smile never fading. But Margaret's mocking words and Charles's cold indifference had only been the beginning. Discrimination, like an undercurrent, was rising, and the Bennett family, along with their guests, seemed determined to push Rosa into the dark corner of invisibility. When Rosa approached a nearby table, hoping to find a seat to enjoy her grandson's wedding, the guests around subtly pulled their chairs away, as if her presence were a disturbance best avoided. A woman in a silver silk gown, her platinum hair swept into an elegant bun, tilted slightly to the side, glanced briefly at Rosa, then quickly turned away, resuming her story about an art auction in Paris. A middle-aged man, a gleaming gold ring on his finger, pushed his chair farther back, as if even proximity to her might diminish his standing in the eyes of the crowd. These gestures, though refined, cut like knives into the air around Rosa, turning her into an isolated island in a sea of people. With the calm of someone long familiar with storms of prejudice, Rosa smiled gently, resting her hand on the chair and taking a seat. She tried to strike up a conversation with a nearby guest, a young woman in a blue dress, asking in her warm voice, "This dish looks exquisite. Do you happen to know how it's made?" The reply was curt, "Oh, I'm not sure," followed by an awkward smile before the woman turned away, feigning interest in her champagne. Another man across the table didn't even bother to respond when Rosa asked about the weather. He merely shrugged and continued his conversation with the person beside him, as if Rosa were invisible. Though seemingly minor, these small reactions landed like a series of blows veiled in politeness, but steeped in disdain. The discrimination didn't end there. When a server passed by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, Rosa reached for a small tart, her eyes lighting up with simple joy. But Margaret Bennett, standing not far away, visibly winced, as if Rosa's act was an affront to the elegance of the occasion. Turning to a relative beside her, she murmured sarcastically, "Some people aren't familiar with how things work at events like this." Soft laughter followed an ensemble of complicity that rippled through the crowd like a toxic wave. Nearby guests, though silent, exchanged knowing glances, as if Rosa were the punchline to a joke only they understood. James, standing a few steps away, saw everything. His heart clenched with each gesture, each remark, every one a blade slicing through his pride. His radiant smile had long vanished, replaced by a tense expression, eyes burning with fury. He stepped closer, gripping Rosa's hand tightly, as if shielding her from the world. "Grandma, I can't take this anymore," he whispered, voice trembling with anger. "They don't have the right to treat you like this." He wanted to scream, to confront Margaret, Charles, the entire crowd, for the woman who had sacrificed her whole life for him. But Rosa, as calm as a still lake before a storm, gently squeezed his hand. Her eyes flashed with a sharp glint. "It's all right, James," she said, her voice low yet commanding. "They think they're winning, but they're digging their own grave." Her words soft as they were carried the weight of prophecy. They weren't just comfort for James, they were a warning. The arrogance of the Bennett family and their guests would soon be unmasked. Rosa stood there, small but unyielding, like an ember waiting to ignite. Her smile never wavered, but her eyes had sharpened, as though she had seen the end of this evening long ago. Meanwhile, the Bennetts and their guests, cloaked in self-importance, and polite grins, continued to glide through the crowd, oblivious to the storm they were drawing ever closer to. As the violins played on, the wedding atmosphere grew heavier than ever, like the entire garden was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the truth would erupt. Light from the crystal chandeliers still cascaded over the mansion's garden, like a shimmering veil draped across every shadowy corner. Still, it could not dispel the chill of arrogance weaving through each banquet table. The clinking of champagne glasses echoed against the soft wail of violins and the ringing laughter of the guests, creating a symphony of extravagance. White rose petals lined the sparkling cobblestone path, like a trail leading to a world where money and status ruled all. Servers in crisp white uniforms moved effortlessly through the crowd, with trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres and expensive wines catering to guests who saw themselves as the center of the universe. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a stage, a grand display of wealth and power. And at its pinnacle stood the Bennett family, white American aristocrats, reigning like monarchs on a glittering throne. But amid the lavish scene sat Mrs. Rosa Washington, quiet and composed at a table near the garden's edge. Her gentle smile remained even as the Bennets and guests' contemptuous gestures pierced like invisible daggers. She held a glass of fruit juice, her eyes glowing with quiet joy, as she watched James and Sophia glide through the crowd with radiant smiles. Yet that joy was surrounded by isolation, by constant glances and whispers aimed her way. The Bennett family, their smugness sharpened by generations of privilege, didn't merely ignore Rosa. They made her invisible, treating her presence as a blemish on their perfect portrait. In her shimmering pearl green silk gown, Margaret Bennett stood near another table, sipping red wine with the poise of a queen. Her eyes swept across the crowd, pausing on distinguished guests, a federal judge with a dazzling smile, a fashion CEO flaunting a limited edition handbag, and a tech billionaire fresh in from London. She bowed to them with radiant smiles and honeyed words about million-dollar ventures and Caribbean vacations. But when her eyes landed on Rosa, that smile vanished, replaced with a sneer. She turned to a relative and whispered just loud enough for Rosa to hear, "James outdid his origins, didn't he?" Quite impressive considering where he came from. The words poison-tipped arrows cut through the air, followed by soft laughter from a few nearby guests. A woman in a golden gown shrugged her eyes, grazing over Rosa, as if she were living proof of the background Margaret referred to. A man with a gleaming gold watch stifled a laugh, as though Margaret's remark was an inside joke only the elite could appreciate. But Rosa, as calm as a still lake, lifted her glass of juice and let her eyes glide over Margaret without a flicker. She had lived too long, heard too many remarks like that to be shaken by venom cloaked in civility. James, standing not far away, heard Margaret's jab, his heart-clenched fists, tightening eyes burning with fury. He turned to Sophia, hoping she would speak up and defend the grandmother who had sacrificed everything for him. But Sophia, in her white silk wedding dress, bit her lip, her eyes flicking between James and her mother. It was her wedding day, and she didn't want to shatter the carefully curated perfection her family had built. "James, just let it go," she whispered, her voice trembling, her hand brushing his in an attempt to soothe. But her silence, though well-meaning, felt like another blade to James's heart. Sensing her grandson's tension, Rosa gently set her glass down, her eyes flashing with a sharp glint. She said nothing, but the way she sat upright with the poise of someone who had faced the world head-on was a silent declaration she was not invisible. Meanwhile, the Bennett family continued gliding through the crowd, flattering the elite, unaware that their arrogance was planting the seeds of a storm. And as the champagne glasses clinked again, the wedding atmosphere grew heavier, as though the entire garden was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to erupt. The brilliance of the crystal chandeliers still bathed the garden in golden splendor, as if trying to conceal the cracks of arrogance now spreading beneath the surface. The clinking of champagne glasses, the soaring violins, and the laughter of guests blended into a picture of upper-class perfection. But beneath the glittering facade, the atmosphere had grown stifling heavy with sarcasm and disdain directed at Mrs. Rosa Washington. Rosa sat quietly at a table near the garden's edge, in her simple, deep indigo dress, and shimmering silver hair. Her gentle smile remained, but her eyes had sharpened, as if she were waiting for the perfect moment to turn the game on its head. Sophia stood beside James, in her radiant white silk wedding gown, her gaze flickering between him and her family. Her mother Margaret's cruel comment about James's background still echoed, making her bite her lip, her heart in turmoil. She wanted to speak to defend Rosa and James, but the pressure to preserve the perfection of her wedding day held her back. "James, just let it go," she whispered again, her trembling hand brushing his. But her silence, though meant to calm, built an invisible wall, deepening the distance between her and James. His burning gaze met hers, as if asking whether she would stand by him or her family. Elsewhere at the reception, Charles Bennett, Sophia's father, played the part of the perfect host. Standing among his circle of powerful friends, tycoons, and politicians, he smiled broadly and spoke boomingly. Raising his glass of red wine, he launched into a story about outdated customs, his tone patronizing, as if delivering a lesson to the world. "Today we need new standards, values that suit the modern age," he declared, his eyes glinting with self-satisfaction. His words, wrapped in diplomacy, carried a clear message. The traditions of James's family of Rosa were outdated and unworthy of the elite world he occupied. The surrounding guests laughed heartily, nodding in agreement, as if Charles had just spoken an undeniable truth. But seated not far away, Rosa merely raised her glass of juice. Her gaze swept past Charles undisturbed, as if she'd heard such words 1,000 times before. But amid the arrogance and laughter, a quiet presence drew attention. At a far corner of the garden, away from the bright lights of the main stage, an older man sat alone, his gaze as sharp as a hawk's. He wore a simple, yet impeccably tailored black suit, accented by a dark teal silk tie that shimmered with elegance. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his bearing radiated quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to be flaunted to be respected. Deep and observant, his eyes scanned the crowd, lingering on Margaret, as she mocked Rosa, on Charles, as he told his condescending tale, and finally on Rosa herself, who sat with an unyielding smile. He furrowed his brow, a subtle gesture that carried weight. It was clear he disapproved of what he was witnessing. Rosa, sensing his gaze, looked up, and in a fleeting moment, her eyes met his, and a discreet smile touched her lips. It wasn't a smile of surprise, but of understanding. She and the man shared a secret that no one in the crowd could guess. The man gave the slightest nod, a gesture nearly imperceptible, but transparent in its meaning. He stood with her. Standing beside Rosa, James noticed the exchange, but furrowed his brow, puzzled by its meaning. Still caught in her inner conflict, Sophia remained unaware of the man's presence. Her eyes locked on James, searching for a way to ease his pain. Meanwhile, the Bennett family continued drifting through the crowd, flattering high-profile guests, utterly unaware that the eyes of the mysterious man were tracking their every move. Their arrogance, cloaked in civility, smoldered like a slow-burning flame, one gust away from being extinguished. And as the violins played on the rhythm of the reception, subtly shifted like the entire garden was holding its breath, bracing for the eruption of a devastating truth. A storm was coming, and the mysterious man with his piercing eyes and quiet power seemed to hold the key to unleashing it. The crystal chandeliers seemed to shine brighter than ever, as if the entire garden were holding its breath, awaiting a fateful moment. The soaring violins slowly faded, giving way to the gentle microphone tapping from the main stage. The master of ceremonies, clad in a sleek black suit, stepped forward with a professional smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice echoing through the space. "Tonight, we are honored to welcome a special guest who has profoundly impacted business, philanthropy, and social change. Please join me in welcoming our guest of honor." The crowd erupted into applause, eyes turning eagerly toward the stage. The Bennett family standing nearby straightened in their seats, smug smiles spreading across their faces. Margaret Bennett, in her pearl green silk gown, leaned slightly toward Charles and whispered, "A guest like that will make our celebration even more prestigious." Charles nodded, his eyes glittering with pride, as though the presence of such a high-profile figure was yet another testament to the family's influence. They white American aristocrats prided themselves on attracting big names, and tonight they believed this guest would further cement their elite standing. But then, the air shifted. Silence swept over the garden like a sudden fog. The older man, who had sat quietly in the garden's far corner, his eyes as sharp as a hawk's, rose from his chair. His perfectly tailored black suit framed his tall, lean figure, and his dark teal silk tie shimmered with understated elegance. The crowd turned to watch him, whispers rippling like waves. "Who is that?" asked one guest. "Probably some billionaire," replied another. The Bennetts exchanged glances, their smiles widening, sure they were about to be honored before the entire world. What happened next made the entire garden fall still. Instead of heading to the stage, the mysterious man turned and locked eyes with Rosa Washington, who sat quietly at her table near the garden's edge. With deliberate, steady steps, he made his way toward her, each step like the beat of a fateful drum. The crowd held its breath. The whispers died. Margaret gripped her wine glass, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. Charles furrowed his brow, his smug expression beginning to fade. Standing beside James, Sophia gently took his hand, confusion clouding her eyes. When the man reached Rosa's table, he stopped and bowed his head, an act rarely seen in the prideful world of the elite. "Mrs. Rosa Washington," he said, his deep, warm voice cutting through the silence. "It's been far too long." The crowd froze, as if the world itself awaited an explanation. Rosa, her gentle smile unwavering, looked up at him, her eyes sharp and clear. "Edward," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "You're still as distinguished as ever." His name, Edward Hamilton, crashed down on the Bennett family like a thunderclap. Edward Hamilton, the legendary billionaire, the man who had built a global business empire and funded education and healthcare initiatives worldwide. His name was synonymous with power and compassion, a man revered by the upper echelons of society. And now he was bowing before Rosa Washington, the very woman the Bennetts had spent the entire evening mocking and disregarding. Margaret nearly dropped her wine glass, her hand trembling. Charles froze, his eyes blank, as though his entire world had collapsed. Sophia stood wide-eyed, her gaze darting between Edward and Rosa, trying to understand what was unfolding. Edward turned to face the crowd, his voice now thunderous. "Tonight, I do not stand before you as a businessman or philanthropist, but as a student of Mrs. Rosa Washington." He declared, his eyes shining with reverence. "She is a brilliant mind, a woman who broke through race and class barriers to build an empire from nothing. She has funded scholarships for thousands of underprivileged students and opened doors for those society cast aside. Without her, I and millions of others would never be where we are today." The crowd stood in stunned silence. Then murmurs surged like crashing waves. Some guests lowered their heads, guilt clouding their faces as they recalled how they had ignored Rosa. The Bennett family sat frozen, paralyzed by shame. Rosa, still seated, smiled. Her gaze swept over the crowd with the composure of someone well acquainted with moments like these. But in her eyes, a flicker of light emerged, not triumph, but the deep, unwavering confidence of someone who has always known that justice, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way. The light from the crystal chandeliers seemed to dim as if the mansion garden was bowing its head before the truth was unveiled. The crowd's murmurs rippled like crashing waves, blending with the violins that now sounded like a sorrowful lament. Mrs. Rosa Washington, in her simple deep indigo dress and shimmering silver hair, still sat quietly at her table, her gentle smile unwavering. But now her eyes held an undeniable force, like a flame finally unleashed after years of glowing beneath the surface. Edward Hamilton, the legendary billionaire, stood before her, his gaze gleaming with respect as he continued his tribute. Mrs. Rosa didn't just build wealth, he said, his voice echoing through the silent garden. She built a legacy. She paved the way for people like me, a poor young man who once couldn't even dream of reaching this day. She has been a guiding light for millions. The crowd stood stunned. A few guests lowered their heads, guilt washing over them, as they recalled how they had dismissed Rosa throughout the evening. Those who had chuckled at Margaret Bennett's remarks now remained silent, avoiding her gaze as if confronting the bitter truth about themselves. But no one bore the blow harder than the Bennetts. In her pearl green silk gown, Margaret clutched her wineglass so tightly, her knuckles turned white, her hands trembling like leaves in a storm. The haughty smile that had defined her was replaced by a pale, stricken expression, as though she had been stripped bare before the entire world. Her wineglass tilted a few drops of red, staining the white silk tablecloth, like the bleeding pride of a woman cut to her core. Charles Bennett, the man who had always seen himself as the center of every room, stood frozen, his eyes hollow. His perfectly tailored gray suit could not hide the collapse within. A powerful magnate who had spent his life building a reputation through calculated connections with the right people now found himself undone. The woman he had dismissed, the guest he considered irrelevant, had become a titan, revered by the world he worshipped. That truth struck like a blade to his ego, making him feel smaller than ever. He glanced at Margaret, a silent plea in his eyes, but she only lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. Sophia, standing beside James, felt her heart clench. Her shimmering white wedding dress now felt like a weight pressing down her shoulders. She looked at Rosa, her eyes brimming with regret, then turned to James. "James, I didn't know," she whispered, voice cracking with shame. She wanted to apologize, but the words caught her throat. James looked at her, his expression both pained and resolute. He didn't respond, but the way he tightened his grip on her hand seemed to say, "This isn't the time for blame. It's the time to face the truth." In a desperate attempt to salvage her dignity, Margaret stepped forward. Her smile was forced trembling, and her eyes revealed sheer panic. "Mrs. Rosa." "Oh, we had no idea," she said, her voice shaky as she struggled to maintain politeness. "If we had known you were, we would have." But Rosa, calm as a mountain before the wind, lifted her eyes to meet Margaret's. Her gaze was sharp, though her smile remained gentle, as if she could see straight through Margaret's facade. "I know," she replied softly, but her words cut like a blade, silencing every excuse. Margaret stood speechless, her fake smile vanishing as she stepped back as though she had just been slapped. James stood beside Rosa, now taller than ever, his eyes shining with pride. He looked at his grandmother, heart full of love and reverence. The woman who had taught him to stand through every storm was now shining brighter than ever, an unextinguishable flame. Edward Hamilton remained nearby, giving Rosa a quiet nod, an unspoken thank you. The crowd no longer dared whisper. They watched in silence, as if witnessing history unfold before their eyes. The Bennett family, once the centerpiece of the celebration, now stood like shadows, pushed to the fringes by a truth they could no longer ignore. Their arrogance, built on wealth and status, had crumbled before Rosa's dignity and legacy. And as the violins began to play again, The atmosphere shifted, like the entire garden now pulsed with the force of justice, waiting for the moment the Bennetts would finally face the full weight of their consequences. The light from the crystal chandeliers seemed to soften, as if the mansion garden itself were exhaling after the storm of truth had swept through. The violins now played more gently, blending with the crowd's murmurs of awe and astonishment, like a soundtrack to the transformation unfolding before their eyes. Mrs. Rosa Washington, still seated in her deep indigo dress and shimmering silver hair, radiated grace. Her warm smile was like the full moon, serene and unwavering, but her eyes now carried a quiet power, like an ocean breeze that could stir the entire sea. Edward Hamilton had stepped back, his gaze still glowing with reverence, as if he had just fulfilled a sacred mission. The Bennett family, once the proud center of the celebration, now stood shattered, broken statues, crushed beneath the truth of who Rosa was. Sophia stood beside James in her glittering white wedding gown, her heart torn in two. Her silence in the face of her family's cruel remarks, meant to preserve harmony, now felt like a burden on her soul. She looked at Rosa, eyes full of remorse, then turned to James, her lips trembling. "James, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice quivering with shame. "I should have spoken up. I should have defended your grandmother." Her words, though late, were sincere confessions from the depth of her heart. James looked at her, his eyes softening but still serious. He squeezed her hand, his voice low but firm. "It's not your fault, Sophia. What matters is what we do from here." Rosa, having heard their exchange, lifted her gaze. Her eyes were gentle but piercing, like a teacher guiding students through one of life's great lessons. "A good start," she said to Sophia, her voice warm, like sunlight breaking through the darkness. "Change doesn't come from words. It comes from action. Live so that what you've learned today becomes your legacy." Like a small but enduring flame, her words lit hope in Sophia's heart. She nodded, eyes now filled with resolve. Her hand tightened around James's. "I promise, Grandma," she said firmly. "Our marriage won't be built on pride or prejudice. I'll prove that." James, standing tall beside Rosa, was filled with pride. He looked at his grandmother, overwhelmed with love and admiration. "Grandma, I'm proud to be your grandson," he said, voice trembling with emotion. Rosa smiled, her thin hand reaching out to gently touch his. Her eyes sparkled, as if to say she had always believed in him. That moment between grandmother and grandson felt like an invisible thread tying past to future, a testament to the power of heritage and family. Meanwhile, the Bennett family had faded into the shadows. Pale-faced Margaret sat silently at her table, avoiding everyone's gaze, as if trying to shrink from her shame. Charles, once proud of his authority, now bowed his head. His eyes were hollow, as if coming to terms with the fact that his reputation had been irreparably tarnished. They who once viewed Rosa as an irrelevant presence now had to face the truth. They had insulted a woman whose influence far surpassed their own. The crowd who had once ignored Rosa now gathered around her with reverence in their eyes. Some guests approached hesitantly, asking to shake her hand, their voices trembling with admiration. "Mrs. Washington, it's an honor to meet you," said a man in a gray suit, eyes lowered with guilt. Rosa responded with her signature gentle smile, her voice calm but resolute. "Thank you. But remember, respect doesn't come from reputation. It comes from how we treat one another." Like a precious gem, her words silenced the crowd, as if inviting them to reflect on their values. Edward Hamilton stood nearby, observing with a quiet smile. He knew the truth about Rosa wasn't just a revelation, it was a lesson that would stay with them forever. The Bennett family now pushed to the margins, was no longer the center of attention. Their arrogance, once masked by wealth and status, had been stripped away, and they were left to face a bitter truth. They were unworthy of standing in Rosa's light. And as the violins played again, the wedding atmosphere shifted into a new rhythm, one that signaled the beginning of change, a commitment to a future where prejudice had no place. The sunset had entirely faded, leaving the mansion garden bathed in the gentle glow of crystal chandeliers, twinkling like stars across a night sky. The violins now played a solemn melody, a farewell to arrogance, and a welcome to humility. Mrs. Rosa Washington, still seated in her simple indigo dress and silver-glinting hair, smiled serenely, her presence like moonlight illuminating the entire garden. The truth about her, a legendary entrepreneur and philanthropist who had changed millions of lives, had shaken the event to its core, leaving behind a lesson that would be etched into every guest's mind. The Bennett family, once the proud centerpiece of the celebration, now lurked like shadows in the background, forced to face the consequences of their prejudice. Charles Bennett, the man who once considered himself untouchable, sat silently at the table, his eyes vacant. His tailored gray suit could no longer mask the failure carved into his soul. He, a powerful tycoon who built his reputation by associating with the right people, had disrespected the most important woman in the room. He quietly emailed Rosa's foundation, offering a partnership in a belated attempt to salvage his dignity. But there was no reply. That simple gesture, though small, was a silent confession that he had been wrong, that all his power couldn't cover the shallowness of his character. Pale and shaken, Margaret Bennett tried to reclaim some pride by donating to Rosa's foundation, but received only a curt thank you from the foundation manager. She sat there, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Her once glittering pearl green gown was now a bitter reminder of the arrogance that had brought her to this moment. Every mocking word and disdainful glance she had directed at Rosa now felt like arrows turned inward, piercing her pride. She began to reflect in the silence for the first time in years. Were fame and status truly everything? Or had she lost something far more important? Sophia and James, standing near the main stage, were now the heart of a new story, one of change and commitment. With a determined gaze, Sophia held James's hand tightly, as if to declare she would never let prejudice divide them again. "I promise you, James," she said firmly, "our family will be different. We will build a future based on respect, not division." James smiled, his eyes shimmering with trust, and squeezed her hand in return. "I believe in you, Sophia," he said, his voice warm, "and we'll do it together." From a distance, Rosa watched them, her eyes sparkling with pride. She knew today's painful revelations had planted the seeds of change. She didn't demand apologies or seek compensation. For her, the truth had spoken, and that was enough. She lifted her glass of juice, took a small sip, and let her gaze sweep across the garden, like someone who had completed a long journey. She had proven that dignity needs no spotlight, that a person's worth is found in how they treat others, not in what they own. The crowd, now entirely transformed, surrounded Rosa with admiration. A woman in a red dress quietly approached, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Rosa, I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. You are truly an inspiration." Rosa smiled gently and replied, her voice soft yet resolute. "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to yourself and live differently." Like a priceless gem, her words made the woman bow her head in reflection. Other guests, business people and politicians alike, gathered around Rosa, eager to learn more about her journey. But she smiled and declined to become the center of attention. To Rosa, the spotlight was never the goal. The lesson was, as the event drew to a close, the light from the chandelier seemed softer, as if the garden itself were bidding farewell to a deeply emotional day. The Bennett family, once reigning in pride, now had to face a bitter truth. They were unworthy of Rosa's light. Charles and Margaret, despite their attempts to make amends, knew their reputation had been stained beyond repair. Whether they would truly change or continue living in the shadow of their failure was something only time would tell. Sophia and James, bound by a renewed commitment, stepped out of the garden, their eyes bright with hope. Rosa, the woman who had ignited the flame of truth, remained seated, her gaze sweeping across the garden like a silent victor. And as the violins played one final note, the garden seemed to echo an eternal lesson. Respect does not come from wealth or status, but from how you treat others. Because sometimes the person you look down on today will be the one who humbles you tomorrow.